My name is Natasha Freeman. I'm a project director for SHEC, the Health and Safety Department at Turner and Townsend. I've been involved in health and safety and particularly construction and CDM for over 30 years. I'm not on the project now, but I was on the SHRA project through 2.1 and going into 2.2, not been on the HUG project. So I'm familiar with the kind of work that you need to do. I'm familiar with the environment in which you're working in. And I just want to say right at the outset, whilst all of the new legislation is aimed at HRBs, high risk buildings, some of the buildings, most of the buildings you'll be working in won't fit into this category. However, what I've done is given you a full briefing here simply because what you'll find is that the building safety regulator, who are part of the HSE, are trying to bring all of this legislation in so it's applicable to everything. And they've been very ham-fisted about the fact that even though we said we didn't want a combined principal designer building regs and a building regs role, that they're trying to bring it in now. And the way that the legislation is worded, the Building Safety Act, I think it's something like 152 pages long, and it's all written in legalese. And I think I've read it more than anybody else has read it because I've been representing Turner and Townsend in the changes that we've been making to accommodate what needs to be done for compliance and then communicating that to our clients. It's written in such a way that the Secretary of State can change applicability of this legislation so it's all projects, regardless of what the sector it's in or the length of the project or the risk of the project. And they're trying to do that right from the very outset. And they've made that clear since the Building Safety Act came in on October the 1st last year. And also the changes and amendments that have been creeping in. There's one come out over the weekend, which is all to do with building regs and their building regs register, their approved persons register, but I'll cover that as I go through. So what I would say is watch this space and I'll explain to you why you don't know about it already and why lots of people are loath to present on this particular subject. Okay, so brief background to the new regulations and where we came from. Definition of a high risk building, and they've changed it from high rise to high risk, and they've changed it from high rise residential building to high risk building so they can make it apply to all buildings when we get to the end of our journey. I'm going to talk about relevant legislation only. There's lots of legislation around this. Building Safety Act and summary of changes and applicability. Transitional arrangements, because we're into that from the 1st of October till April 2024. And existing projects and where you sit with that, because some of your programs have already started. People are finishing off 2.1, starting 2.2, and we're in the middle of HUG projects. Duty holders and competence that you need to know about, the gateway process, product information, and just a little bit on what the building safety regulator is looking for as part of completion, and planning a retrofit project to meet compliance. So where it all started, it shames me to say this because everything we do in health and safety, where we talk about preventing things from reoccurring, we do straight away. We've been working on this since the 14th of June 2017. It's taken that long to go through Parliament because the changes have been complicated, because they're interwoven into what we already do, and it's the impact of that. Dame Judith Hackett used to be in charge of the HSE several years ago, and she was tasked with looking at all the reports and recommendations that came out of the inquiry after the Grenfell Tower disaster to prevent a reoccurrence. And what we call the Hackett report is where she's drawn all of that together and in layman's terms told you what the recommendations are and therefore what's required for compliance. And it starts off with the headlines that the only way that we can change this is to have a major shift in the way property is managed, the way that construction work is managed, not just in properties where we have residential properties, but eventually all property, and the culture of construction. And that's the reason why they've worded the Building Safety Act the way they have, because you can only change the culture of construction if you change it for everybody and on all projects. They started to look just at residential property and HRBs, and they realised through the tender returns that were coming through for projects generally that people were shifting from doing construction work and refurbishment work on residential property to non-residential, and that's not what they wanted. And because the Secretary of State can change things at the drop of a pin, the wording of the Act will allow him to do so. So we should already be doing what needs to be done. So the HSE haven't made a big thing about telling you what the changes are. It's up to you, as it always has been, to see if there's any changes to building regs or legislation around what you do. And because they're saying it's a betterment of what we already do and not new legislation, they've not made a big thing about announcing what those changes are or when they'll take effect. I've been lucky enough to be one of 120 people that have been attending the building safety regulator calls week on week to see how these changes will be implemented. And that's what I'm conveying to you here, not just for the work that you do on HUG and SHRA, but what you're going to have to implement across the board. And that might mean changes to the way that you control your projects and your safe delivery of projects. So we should already be doing what needs to be done. The definition of an HRB, a high-rise building, to mark the eventual inclusion of non-residential property. It's the start. No new legislation needed, just a betterment, and regulation to ensure statutory compliance by the building safety regulator has introduced that duty holder. They've already warned us that they're going to be very proactive. And the reason for that is because with this legislation coming through and being pushed through the House of Lords and the House of Commons the way it has been, there's an expectation by the government and by the general public, particularly tenants, that the building safety regulator will be seen to be proactive. They're going to be involved. They're going to be looking at what we do. They're already in control of the building reg sign-off process and building applications, which is what we see as Gateway 1. Recognition of accountability and the introduction of new duty holders, and that's for property as well as construction. So, headline changes relating to the process for HRBs. Most changes are focused primarily on high-risk buildings, but they will drift into all construction projects in time to achieve a change in culture in construction. Now, they're going to look at all residential projects to begin with. So they'll move from HRBs to all residential projects, which is why there's an impact on what you do, and then into wider construction. Building regulation compliance already applies to all construction. So they're saying that everybody should be with the programme from day one. And day one was October the 1st last year. For property management, there's an introduction of duty holders that you'll now recognise as the principal accountable person, the accountable person and the responsible person. And they all have distinct different duties in the way that property is managed and the interface with contractors. And then the registration of buildings and the building safety case and resident engagement. And that's maintaining the golden thread. When you put together the handover file and that goes into any folder they have for existing building information, we're calling that the golden thread. As far as construction management's concerned, you're looking at the introduction of the gateway system, changing the process for planning applications and permissions. Revision of the building control process, that is probably the biggest change you will see, and adding a new duty holder through building regulations. The principal designer, building regulations PDBR, it's a new role and sits alongside the CDM principal designer duty holder role. I'll say to you now, this is the way that they're ham-fisted in trying to introduce that new role now in consultation for the PAS 8671 document, which tells you what a PD should do and what a PDBR needs to do. We said that we didn't want a combined role. So in the industry, 83% of us said we didn't want the role, so they couldn't do it. But what they're doing is they're saying that we need a PDBR and where we have to comply with building regulations and a principal designer on every project we do, regardless of them being an HRB. So that's the direction in which it's travelling. And then increasing deliverables from CDM clients and the principal contractor duties. And we'll cover those briefly. So definition of a high risk building. It's a building must be 18 metres or 7 stories in height and contain 2 or more residential units. If any part of the basement is below ground and you can see light wells, you have to count the basement floor as an extra story. If the light well you can see is adjacent to the building that you're working on and is below the level of normal ground floor access, you have to count that as part of your building. These are very subtle changes to implementation that we've heard on the Building Safety Regulator call. They don't say that in black and white in the legislation, so always worth checking. I did a lot of work for the Crown Estate, and they went to the great pains of measuring all of their buildings from the lowest ground floor, front or back of the building, up to the roof, and then had to go and do further surveys when they introduced this as part of implementation, even though they didn't change the regulations. Building Act 1980 is what supports both the changes in the Building Safety Act and building regulations changes, supports that HRBs include hospitals and care homes. So, relevant legislation. Fire Safety England regulations relating to HRBs particularly have put in place a new requirement to register the HRB on the local fire rescue service respective portals. So wherever you are, the landlord should have already registered their buildings if they're HRBs. That will spread to all residential at some point in time. That had to be done by April 2023 last year. If a building is new or comes into that category, there is still an obligatory requirement to register that building. There's a requirement to upload external wall surveys to that same portal. The engagement of a responsible person by the landlord or building owner, because that is the person that talks to the tenants. That's the person who's employed by the building owner to communicate directly with the tenants. Any changes, particularly during construction or refurbishment, that might impact on them. Implementation of a resident engagement strategy that shows how they'll do that. So you should be being told how that's being done and what you need to provide to facilitate that. Signage and girder box requirements for the bigger buildings, the ones that are in scope. Introduction of an interim risk management system and mandatory occurrence reporting, particularly for buildings which are HMOs and larger buildings, which I've just described, are in scope, your 18 metre, 7-storey. There should be an interim risk management system in place that communicates to the tenants and the residents exactly what the impact of your building works are as a wider picture. You don't need to do that anymore. You do need to, as part of SHRA and HUG, communicate your programme and what works you'll do and when, but you don't have to do the actual impact on existing arrangements. That's now the responsibility of the responsible person. Section 156 of the Fire Safety Act talks about the impact of the competency of fire risk assessors and sharing the fire risk assessment findings with those on whom they impact. That's not just the residents, that's contractors. So if you're working in an HRB, you should be given a copy of the fire risk assessment. So if there's any failures in the building at all, that you're aware of them before you go and set up your site there or start to work there. Building Safety Act and building regulations. It's the introduction of the new duty holders, PDBR, principal accountable person, that should be accountable person, responsible person, and the building safety regulator. Introduction of the gateway system and registration of the HRBs with the building safety regulator. That is a separate process from registering the building with the fire rescue service, and that needed to be done by the end of September last year. Readiness for the October regulations coming out. If anybody has an HRB and they haven't registered them with the building safety regulator, that is now a criminal offence because the registration was brought in time for that and to allow for registration. So Building Safety Act, I'm not going to run you through this slide. It's just to show you how the Building Safety Act has impacted on the Fire Safety Act. And then down the left-hand side, you've got all those documents which also relate to building regulations. The colour coding is where you'll find bits and pieces of each in different ones. So the high risk buildings descriptions and supplementary provisions regulations, some of that is represented in the Building Safety Act, and some of it is also found in the Building Safety Regulators charges regulations. So you have to read both documents. Don't just concentrate on one. The 5 down the side explain transitional arrangements. They explain exemptions. They explain where you are with an existing project, and they explain where you're not an HRB, how these regulations reflect on you. Those are 5 key documents, easily downloadable from either the Building Safety Regulator site or the HSE site. Download those 5 and look at them. They're your Bible for what work needs to occur. The Building Safety Act summary of changes, they came in gradually. Because they came in gradually and they started on August 2021 with Gateway 1 and needing a fire statement in your planning application, I've laid out there where it all kicked in, where the last part of it kicks in April 2024 with building control. There's a summary there to help you find what you want in all of those pieces of legislation. What happened just before October was there was a huge complaint while all this was waiting to go through the House of Lords and Commons from other interested parties and stakeholders as far as the government was concerned. They were saying if they needed to check compliance and implementation, they really needed to know what was going on, because as well as not telling you what new legislation was going on, they didn't tell those interested stakeholders. So what they did, the Building Safety Regulator and the HSE, was they sent a circular letter. And the circular letter went to all of the people that are represented in that first paragraph, including the fire service, to let them know that they were going to start actually bringing in regulatory compliance and enforcement based on those 6 documents below. There are 5. The last one's repeated twice because there are 2 different parts of it. And if you're looking at making sure that you comply with anything, those are the 5 that need to be your Bible, not just the Building Safety Act. Again, a summary of building control changes I just wanted to talk you through. The building control process for high risk buildings and wider changes to procedural building regulations is something that you also need to be aware of if you need building regs sign off from an approved inspector. The building control process for high risk buildings has absolutely changed. The rest of the changes will come in on April 2024, where basically you need to have your building control officer on the register that belongs to the Building Safety Regulator. If they are not on that register, you won't be able to use them, even for existing projects. What will happen is, and this will happen for all new projects which are HRB, is you'll need to apply through the planning application to the Building Safety Regulator, and they will tell you which approved inspector, building control officer, you need to use. You can ask for one, and that one has to be on their register. They need to go through several hurdles to get on that register and show competence. They can appoint a local authority approved inspector, or they can be the approved inspector themselves, depending on how complicated the project is or what risks are associated with that building. Transitional arrangements from October the 1st, again, I've made an easy layout there for you to follow through to see whether you need to be contacting the BSR or whether you can finish the work you're doing without doing that, but simply make all documents available when we get to Gateway 3. And again, transitional arrangements there. It's slightly different for you guys because all of your tenants in the smaller properties will always remain in occupation. So achieving a sign off for Gateway 3 is going to be very difficult. I think you're going to have to agree a process where if you need to go to the Building Safety Regulator, you agree what needs to be done. In the same way that when under CDM, a principal designer, I've had to lodge an F10, but it's for several properties. It's impossible to get a completion for all of those properties, a sectional completion. And that's what you'll be doing because you're working to a program. You're not doing one big handover. So it'll have to be something that's agreed with them if that's what you need to do. There is one of the documents that is actually called transitional arrangements of those 5 that are highlighted. So have a look at that. For existing projects, rule of thumb, where the projects have already commenced and planning consent, if applicable, has been received, where a building control officer is already appointed, you just carry on until you've completed. You only worry about what you need to do when it comes to handover documents and that golden thread piece. If you have projects which are about to start, and that includes remediation work and refurbishment work, to make sure you've engaged a building control officer for those works and seek planning permission if required ASAP. I said before 1st of October because if you've already asked one to work for you, but included projects at a later date, as you've got phases for a project, you still may come underneath that first bullet point. Even though you're giving them a new tranche of projects, it's a project you'd already engaged them for. As long as a meaningful start on site has been achieved prior to April 24, you can continue as is. The definition for a meaningful start is different for each project. It's different for the type of work you do. The document that you need to look at is the 909 document, the Building and Buildings England HRB Regulations 2023. They're all numbered. The statutory instrument you want is 909. And if you go to Schedule 202, some of the work that you're actually doing will be exempt from notification. That's all in Schedule 2 of that document. So take time to read that one up first, because where you're actually putting in controls to existing systems and not replacing them, or for some of the stuff that you're putting in for the first time, so you're introducing systems, depending on the impact on the rest of the building, you may not need to bring this into the gateway process. For other construction projects, it means more than a spade in the ground. Meaningful start used to mean spade in the ground. They've now changed that to sufficiently progressed work. The fact that you've already started this on several properties in a programme might be deemed to be sufficiently progressed work. The fact that you're now moving to work in new properties as part of your continuing programme doesn't necessarily mean it's new work. If you didn't have a BCO on board at October the 1st, then you need to apply to the Building Safety Regulator, who will appoint one for you, as I've just described. But remember, the projects that you do and the projects you've already started, they're one project. The fact that the address changes is neither here nor there. We're still looking at the project name. So the Building Safety Regulator, to oversee the safety and performance of all buildings with a particular focus on HRBs. They're a distinctly different arm from the HSE that will look at construction sites. In all likelihood, they're not likely to appoint somebody from the HSE to come and look at construction or refurbishment if you've got somebody engaged in the role of the Building Safety Regulator, because they do plan to come out to site where you've got to meet buildings regs compliance. They want to come out as you're doing those works. It'll be an additional charge to the project, and it's something that they've said that they're absolutely going to do as part of their service delivery. To promote organisational capability within the sector. So they're looking at property managers as well as construction to make sure those duty holder roles are fulfilled with competent people and that systems are in place. So the onus isn't just on you. The property owners, and particularly where that is an organisation, needed to have systems in place to feed you the information and to tell you exactly how they want it. With SHRA project works that are already in transition, this is something that's going to have to come retrospectively if it hasn't already. I haven't worked on SHRA for over a year, so I'm not quite sure where you are with that information coming from the client. To promote competence, particularly for duty holders, existing and new rules apply. Very much commanded by insurance. The insurers have been all over this since day one. So where it comes to matters of competence, if the client is not sure, it'll be the insurers that are doing checks and balances on yourself. To manage the gateway process and be actively involved in buildings regs compliance, and to lead enforcement in the new regulatory framework. They have said they're going to be visible, bold, and interacting with people. So that's the warning they've given to us. We did complain that they've not made this known to everybody else, just the 120 on the call. And their response was that we represented the industry. And therefore, because we'd been chosen, it was a closed call to represent industry, they expected us to go away and give people that message. Building control inspectors. Building Safety Regulator has already opened a register, and all current building control officers have needed to apply since last year if they wish to continue to deliver the service post April 24. If they're not on the register, they can't act as a building control officer. That's not just for HRBs. They said HRB at the beginning, and then they've informed the building control officers that they want that in for any type of project. So you can see the direction it's going in. If you're already using a BCO, please continue, but make sure that they're on the register or they intend to go on the register so you can keep on using them to the end of your project. If you don't have a BCO or didn't have one for your project at 1st of October, and or planning permission is still required because you only had outline planning permission, not full planning permission, or it was rejected, you come under the new regime. There is only ever now going to be full planning permission, not planning permission in principle. Because the BSR is controlling everything, they've said they will not give yes to a maybe. They want as much information as possible. REBA 2 now, from the projects I've been working on, to give a yes or a no to approving a project. Okay, a planning permission approval. They don't want to say, yes, this is okay, come back to us later. They don't want that because they say that you're asking them to decide things for you, and that's not their role. If you've already submitted planning permission and you want to extend it to include new works under an existing application, you bypass the building safety regulator and go back to the local authority for Gateway 1. Even though they're now in charge of planning applications, if you want to amend one that's already been approved by local authority, it's them that you go back to. If you came under the new regime on 1st of October, any changes to planning application go to the BSR and they need to be classified as major or notifiable. If it's major, full design drawings and material data are needed to accompany the application for reconsideration, and you need to stop work on that part of the project until approved. So if you're working on a big project, but you only want to change the roof on building A, it's only the roof works on building A that stop. Everything else carries on until you wait for a decision from them. They've promised a quick turnaround. Don't know whether that will happen. They are resourced to do it because they're using the local authority and the fire rescue as other people for enforcement and checking compliance. If it's a notifiable change where the change is minor, and that might be simply the change of principal designer, you can carry on working whilst waiting for the decision to continue. They've tried to promise that a 2-week turnaround will occur where it's just notifiable because you've carried on working. Competency, the building safety regulator has approved the building control competency assessment scheme provided by Total Training Development Limited. That's their model for your BCOs to comply with. And competence assessments are the first step in becoming a registered building control inspector and on their register if you want to continue to work in this profession. If you want to work in construction and you're not in this register, you're not able to work. It's as simple as that. Evidence in competence also extends to the principal designer building regs, completely new role under the gateway process, and assigned statements required attesting to PDBR capability to deliver the role as part of the gateway sign-off process. So they're only really interested in whether your PDBR is competent to deliver the role at gateway 2, just before you commence work, or at the end of the project when you're looking for occupational reoccupation. Eventually, they're setting up a register for PDBRs, so they won't have to repeat that process as new projects emerge. Where building regs compliance is complex, you're going to need a PDBR who possesses a higher degree of competence. You're always going to need now, according to their implementation understanding, a PDBR and a PD. I questioned whether it was applicable to all projects, and the response I got from Andrew Moore, who is in charge of the whole thing at the Building Safety Regulator's office, said as far as enforcement's concerned, if building regulations compliance is required, you will need a PDBR, regardless of it being an HLB or the sector that you're building in. So I have an email that attests to that. I'm not just guessing at implementation. I did challenge because it wasn't their intent to do it, but they've just gone in with hard boots now. PAS 8671 is a principal designer competency document. It's also alluded to in the Building Safety Act, but you're going to have to dig it out of there. The best thing to do is to look at it in the Building Designer Competency 8671 document. They're going to make that a building standard. They said they were going to do it by the end of January, but they haven't done it yet. Principal contractor, same thing again. tells you what competency for a principal contractor is required. It also says, as a principal contractor, you need to be competent enough to engage subcontractors and check their competency. Principal contractor is responsible for doing that for their designers as well as their subcontractors. So if you've got designer portions, contractor design portions to deliver, that means you're doing the same thing for your PD for designers, your design team. And the client's responsible for checking the competency of the design team and the PD, not necessarily the principal contractor. So that's your responsibility for your design team. Remember, design also means specification. It doesn't have to be a drawing. It may be a specification of materials or a specification of the deliverable. So it's uniform across all of the properties that you're dealing with. The gateway system I've broken down into 4 slides to give you a lot more detail. Gateway 1 is already in place. It snuck in 2021 through the Town and Country Planning Act. And they did that so that they could be sure that they could push Gateway 2 and 3 through the House of Lords and the House of Commons. It was strategic on their part. And all everybody saw at that point was that if you put in a planning application, Appendix A asked for a fire statement as to how the project would be managed during construction and enabling the impact on the residents or tenants, particularly if it's an existing building, and then how that will look when you do handover. Okay, now what they were doing is they were rejecting, I think in the end it was something like 60 to 80% of applications because that fire statement was not done by a fire consultant or a fire person. They didn't specify it needed to be done, but on that you have to tell people when you've signed the statement who you are and what your qualifications are. And it was clear on the feedback that's what they were doing. Gateway 2 came in from the 1st of October 23, and it's needing approval from the BSR for your construction control plan. That isn't your construction phase plan, it's a completely new document, and it talks about the 3 elements I've got there. An outline to how you will plan, manage and monitor design and construction, particularly to meet buildings regs compliance, and particularly how you will do that in an occupied building as to what the interim risk measures will be. You need to provide a timetable for BCO inspections and sign-offs so the BSR can inspect if they want to. If you've already got a building control officer, it still means that the building safety regulator will come out to site. It's not just the ones that they're going to control in a building control and compliance role. Okay, just be aware, if you've got a building control officer already on board, they'll still want to come out when your building control officer goes to site to check what you're doing. They want in the construction control plan a timetable of when building regulation compliance work is done so they can plan their visits accordingly, and they will be charged for. Details from the principal contractor stating they're aware of the building's existing fire arrangements and how their activities will impact on them. That all needs to be in a construction control plan. There isn't a document produced by them as a template for you to use, so you have to put together your own document. I've had to do that for Turner and Townsend for roles on which we are the PDBR. Okay, they don't want to make that prescriptive. They want to make sure that all of those are there. And then one of the documents that you've got in those 5 actually tells you what the construction control plan needs to include. The building safety regulator needs to have that before you plan to start on site. And like the construction phase plan, it's got to be signed off before you can start on site. If you don't have a Gateway 2 approval because your construction control plan meets their requirements, you can't start on site, otherwise it's a criminal offence. If there are material changes to design or product specified at planning permission stage, then construction can only continue with the building safety regulator's permission for that part of the works. That's the major change I talked about earlier. So the building safety regulator is inveigling himself in your current procedures. Gateway 3 needs to be approved by the building safety regulator, even if you didn't need to do Gateway 1 and Gateway 2. I've got a project at the moment which is an HRB. I'm dealing with a commercial tenant who's on floor 3 and part of 1. I'm still having to meet Gateway 3 requirements because it's residential over offices. And I've had to find out who the accountable person is that belongs to the landlord, because I'm going to have to hand them part of the handover file that talks about structural and fire changes and how fire will be managed on that floor, so they can include that in their golden thread and their building safety case. So I've already had to do that and agree with my client that we're going to have to hand the information over to the landlord, even though they normally wouldn't see it, because that's part of achieving Gateway 3. I've then got to have their accountable person sign a statement to say they've taken receipt of it. On any other project where you have to do Gateway 1, 2, and 3, when you get to Gateway 3, the building safety regulator is not interested in having a copy of the handover file. They want to see a letter of receipt from the accountable person as nominated by the building owner to say they are in receipt of all of the handover file. That's all they want. Then they'd reserve the right to check if they want to. So they want access to it if they need to have it. But that's how the process will work. So no, it's not that they won't be able to cope, because I'll be going through reams and reams of information. They want somebody else to commit to it being done. And at that point in time for Gateway 3, they want a PDBR also to say not only is it done, but that the building works have been done in compliance with building regulations. That's the step change that shows the difference between the PDBR and the PD. Gateway 3 talks about, this slide talks about the handover file and what's needed. The one thing that we started asking on all the projects that we deal with, that I have an interface or SHEC have an interface with at T&T, is starting to ask the contractors to take photographic evidence for all fire components. Now you're doing insulation works and you're doing works that get covered up in the final deliverable. Take dated photographs of that work, because where you don't get anybody come to inspect it, particularly from the BSR department, they want to know that the work's been done, particularly for fire compartmentation. It needs to be part of your evidence for your handover file and your building regulations sign off. In their instructions to building safety regulators, they've already told them they're requiring not only photographic evidence for where this takes place, but also they want data information for the products being used. And probably the biggest change that it's easy to describe to you is where in the past for smaller projects, we've been and bought, to put in a fire door, we've bought materials to make architrave, we've bought the fire door from somewhere else, the ironmongery from somewhere else, the glazing from somewhere else, and put it all together. If we don't have a buildings regs fire compliant door set, you're going to have to make sure that you've got proof of how this has all gone together, what it looks like before the architrave goes on, the data sheets to say it's fire resistant glass, that you've used intumescent mastic where you've put the glass into the door, and all of that good stuff, and the fire rating of the door. And that tells you a bit more work about, a bit more information about the work that you need to tell them about. I asked the question on the call more than once in a different way, just to make sure. If we've got a project that's in different phases or different chunks, because when I worked for Crown Estate, we identified several works needed to be done to get a building compliant, particularly where it came to compartmentation. In a big building, you don't do all that work at once. You do the first floor and then you come back and then you do the second floor. And I said, how does that get on with the Gateway 3 application acceptance? And they've described ways in which we could do it. They've suggested doing each one as a separate project. You're not going to get that opportunity when you're doing works on several properties and it's rinse and repeat work. So again, you've got to agree through your building control officer how that will be offered up for a Gateway 3 compliance, because they've not talked about sectional completion or red line drawings or anything throughout this whole process. It doesn't factor into the way that we've told them that's how the mechanics of a project works. Particularly when you're working on envelopes of property, we will do a rinse and repeat on several addresses. You're going to have to test the system. They've not decided whether they're going to accept how it's being done or not. you're going to have to agree how it's being done. Start by talking to your building control officer for buildings reg sign off and see where you go from there. I wouldn't involve the building safety regulator in looking at that at this point in time, because they will get right into what you're doing, and then they'll set standards that everybody will have to meet on the SHRA and HUG programme. Product safety and standards. 2 years ago, Major Contractors Group actually pulled together a catalogue of products which have been tested in the UK and where data has now had to be made available on flammability, durability, and everything, all that good stuff, so that in using these products, you can automatically tick the box for meeting approved document A and approved document B for fire safety compliance and structural compliance, which are buildings regs sign off. They had to hive that document because there was too much coming out all at once, and the HSE hadn't finalised what was coming out in October 23 because it was still going through Parliament. What they've now done is they want to bring that document into operation. So the Building Safety Regulator and the Office for Product Safety and Standards have signed a memorandum of understanding to cooperate in areas relating to their regulatory responsibilities. You're going to see a standards document come out to say that you need to use these products as this data information has been tested and is available. If you don't use those, they're going to be derogations from building control acceptance. Just be aware of that. I don't know when that's coming out. I haven't seen that come out yet. Planning a retrofit project, then almost there to meet compliance. Early engagement with the planning team because there will be a BSR interface. Building Safety Act, Gateway 1 and Town and Country Planning Act requirements. Okay, so I'm telling you where to go to look for the legislation that applies to this. If you already put planning permission in, and it's likely this went in as a job lot, then you're okay. If it didn't, you're looking at a new regime. If you're just looking at new properties which are part of the project, this doesn't apply. Engage an approved inspector for building regulations to comply with the BSA competence requirement, and they've actually got one of those documents which applies to building control officers and building regs compliance, and a new document's come out this weekend that's all about building control, and that tells you all the steps that you need to go through from April and what a building control officer looks like by way of competence. And the first line of that will be that they're already on their approved register, because they will have done those checks and balances for you. Engagement of a PAS 2035 retrofit coordinator and proving their competence. You haven't got somebody part-time filling the role. You've got somebody who has skills, knowledge, and experience and training for actually delivering the role. For the design process and monitoring compliance with PAS 2035-2030. And just an aside from me, if you've got people who have been on the retrofit coordinator scheme or are new to doing this, I would have somebody just oversee what they're doing at this point in time, because they won't have that history of experience behind them. But if they're being overseen, that's a step towards that. Resident engagement strategy is a Fire Safety England regulations requirement. That should already be in place by the building owners. They should have a system that's communicated to you. So any communications around interim risk management while you're in properties, particularly that are occupied, should be being communicated to the tenants and residents by them for you. Engagement of a retrofit project manager to take responsibility for overseeing the assessment of dwellings, and that's what starts your interim risk management process off. The identification, specification, installation and evaluation of energy efficiency measures for a given dwelling in accordance with PAS 2035. When you have a look at that document I mentioned earlier, and that Schedule 2, and what exemptions are in there. This is a formal role to represent the interests of the social landlord and the residents for projects delivered in compliance with PAS 2035. So that's just, again, reinforcing what the retrofit project manager has to do as part of the resident engagement strategy and fulfilment of your role on this scheme. And consider the maintenance of new systems. And the CDM requirements always tell you that you must communicate how systems need to be maintained. Now, I know on SHRA projects, particularly, Explaining to the residents how the controls particularly needed to work and what they needed to do is part of your delivery. So that's your evidence for that.